The war in Ukraine was a terrible debacle that the United States sadly walked into over a 30-year period by expanding NATO, despite Russia's continuing objections. Don't come closer to our border, don't come closer to our border. I know it. I was President Gorbachev's on his economic advisory team 36 years ago. I was President Yeltsin's economic advisor. I was Ukraine's economic advisor to President Kuchma, so I know both sides. The basic point was Russia wanted some space so that the United States wasn't pushing its missile systems, its Aegis missiles, its military bases right up against Russia's borders. But the United States said we go where we want, when we want, where we want, how we want, and the war finally ensued. The war could have ended in 2022. Ukraine and Russia were about to sign a peace agreement based on neutrality for Ukraine. But the United States said, no, we want military bases, we want NATO there, don't sign the agreement. So Ukraine continued to fight. So will Trump end this? He could end this. He just has to say very clearly, publicly, explicitly, NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. That is over. We will not be next to Russia, pushing ourselves into Russia's front yard, basically. And if the U.S. does this, there will be peace in Ukraine because the war will end. It's been a war over NATO enlargement. The war will end on that basis. Unfortunately, President Biden insisted to the last day NATO will expand to Ukraine. President Trump knows it's not right, but he hasn't quite said it yet. So we're close to the war ending, but we're not quite there yet.
From what I understand, the door to a NATO entry is more or less shut for Ukraine. But what you're saying essentially is that you're holding NATO responsible for the war. You're saying this is a war of their making?
Look, I was there when Gorbachev ended unilaterally the Soviet military pact called the Warsaw Pact. He ended it and said peace, and the United States should have ended NATO at that moment. But the United States didn't end NATO. The United States immediately said, we expand NATO. Actually, not immediately. They told President Gorbachev on February 7th, 1990, James Baker III, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward, not 1 inch. Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany, NATO will not move eastward at all. I was there in those days. They promised. They lied. When the Soviet Union ended, President Clinton in 1994 began NATO enlargement. And Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book in 1997 explaining Russia will have no choice but to acquiesce. So it was kind of like playing a poker game. They gambled Ukraine's safety, and they lost. And it was a terrible mistake. And all of the senior diplomats in the United States knew it at the time. Jack Matlock, George Kennan, people that I was dealing with knew that this was a disastrous policy, very dangerous and very provocative. But the politicians went ahead with it anyway because they had the idea that the U.S. was the sole superpower and it could do what it